We're live.
Oh.
Welcome to the next episode of Business Agility Live. And today our guest is Timm, who is a co-founder of LIVEsciences, a radically self-organized company. And Timm is one of the speakers for the upcoming Business Agility Vienna conference. So instead of me spending some time introducing Timm, how about you, Timm, say a few words about yourself?
Sure. Thanks a lot for the intro and thanks a lot for having me here. As you already said, I'm one of the 2 or 3 actually founders of LIVEsciences. We consider ourselves radically self-organized. That's a lot of buzzwords. So the question is what's behind that, I guess. And for me, the whole journey around self-organization started in 2015. Before that, I was working for Big Pharma. I was working for another consultancy, one of the more traditional setups, let's say. But then 2015, a colleague of mine here in Basel actually recommended a book to me called Reinventing Organizations by Frederic Laloux. Some of you guys probably have heard about that. And that was our start of this journey of that self-organized journey. And if we say radically self-organized, it's a fairly small company, of course, but there's all sorts of things that you would expect being there that we probably don't have. So we don't have an org chart, for example. If you work with us, we don't have a line manager. So I don't have a line manager, any of my colleagues, nobody has a line manager. And probably the most radical thing that people kind of are shocked about, most of the cases at least, is our self-set salaries. So everyone defines his or her salary completely free range, autonomous, on their own, without any limitations. And then there's all sorts of other things, of course, that are radically self-organized, which might be the radical transparency that we have and some other things. But that's roughly why we consider ourselves radically self-organized. And of course, working with some of our customers and clients, it's a bit less radical and a bit more focused on how do you get a transformation done in bigger corporations. And I'm sure we'll touch on some of that points as well.
Wow, thank you. That's indeed some shocking information that I bet many companies are not ready for. So based on your experience, and you mentioned Frederic Laloux, is Teal mindset is for everyone?
It's a good question. So the first difficulty I have with that whole thing always is that Teal is not really a defined thing. It's like agile mindset, Teal mindset, growth mindset, all these concepts that are out there, I think are really good ideas. And at the same time, how do you judge? How do you rate? Do I have a Teal mindset or not? Just because I want to know how that stream here works up front doesn't mean I'm a control freak, so I don't have a Teal mindset. I don't know. So I'm just a bit skeptical around these things. But maybe to answer your question, is Teal mindset for everyone? I come from that theoretical motivational science point of view that Herzberg actually published some 50 years ago already. And then also there was McGregor talking about theory X and theory Y people. And I do believe in that theory Y part. Everyone's capable. Every human is capable. All of us are somehow motivated for things. Just need to find the right thing. And I do believe that a Teal mindset is nothing you have or you don't have. I think everyone has it. It's probably more adapted to certain systems where we don't live up to these mindsets, and maybe there's some constraints in bigger corporations. Maybe there's constraints in society or some other constraints that just make it difficult to live up to that ambition level. Maybe, but I do think Teal mindset is nothing that's just there for an elite or some few people or something, and you need to be enlightened in some kind of way. So I totally don't believe in that.
I'm really curious, how do you define Teal organizations then? Because you already started expanding about this, right? So I totally agree with you. Currently, there's so many buzzwords, so much noise in agile community, business agility community. So maybe you can share your personal perspective. What does it mean for you?
Sure. So the basis for all of these Teal ideas that I have as well is definitely from Frederic Laloux and the Reinventing Organizations. So basing it on the 3 pillars that Frederic also describes, which is evolutionary purpose, self-management, and wholeness. So I think that's some key pillars there. The question always is, how do you define that? For example, wholeness. basically means I can bring my whole self, my full human being to work as well. And I don't need to hide. I don't need to wear a mask and pretend something that I'm just not. So now that's a pretty high ambition, one. And two, how do you know you ever get there? But I do think that wholeness is something that in agile environments, in Teal environments, is something that's really, really important. So how do you provide that space of psychological safety as an organization, that people really feel safe enough to speak up, to provide honest feedback? All these things that are just broken, in my point of view, in the corporate world. Just recently talked to a CEO of a big pharma company, of one of the big pharmas, and he said, look, Tim, I didn't get honest feedback in the last 20 years. And he's the CEO of a company, and he probably wants to grow and develop personally as well, and probably would be good for him to get some feedback when he's on the wrong path. And he says he didn't get any feedback for the last 20 years. So this is one thing where I say, if you are able to create that psychological safety space, that safe space somehow, I think this is really, really important for a Teal company. The other part, which is a bit less abstract, probably, is the self-management. So how do you create self-managed teams? How do you create teams which don't have a line manager or no management at all? I always distinguish between management and leadership. So agile Teal organizations, of course, have leadership. Any human system actually has leadership. That's just something that's inherent in all of our systems. And at the same time, manager-less systems is something that I think are really important. And I think it's one of the important criteria, one of the aspects that you will see in many of the Teal organizations. And it could look different in different organizations. It could look more like a holacracy type of setup. Maybe it could look like some kind of peer-based leadership, which is something that's coming up in Germany quite a bit. So there's all sorts of different frameworks that you can use. But I think self-managed teams, manager-less teams, is something that's probably a criteria for that Teal organization. And then obviously the third pillar, evolutionary purpose, also a little bit more abstract, more fluffy. So what's a good purpose? What's evolutionary purpose anyway? So that's difficult to answer. For us, at least, it means it's something that inspires us all, that kind of binds us together as a company, as a group of people as well. And we discuss a lot about our personal purposes and what we want to achieve in life and what's our drivers, our motivators, and then try to find that overlapping space where we, as a company, as a group of people, would say, well, that's a good direction. That's something that inspires us, and that's worth getting up in the morning. That's probably my definition of what Teal really means. Having some direction by a purpose, probably putting purpose first over certain short-term profit decisions. Doesn't mean you shouldn't look at your profit. I mean, any company, any for-profit company at least, should look into that. And definitely we are also measuring that from a KPI perspective. And we have a look at these things like cash flow and all those sorts of things. But we are putting purpose first. So it's not just the next, whatever, 50,000 Swiss francs or something. Also, is it a fit for the purpose? Do we want to work for certain industries? Is a discussion that we had, for example. But that's roughly how I would describe a Teal company.
Thank you. I have another question, because you mentioned your company that is a young consultancy with a smaller amount of people. And it is pretty natural for the startups nowadays to be born agile, to be born with the Teal DNA, so to say. My question to you, is this Teal mindset achievable with the higher level of complexity of the bigger corporations overall?
Definitely a question that comes up all the time. And it's a fair question to ask. I do agree that most startups start with that kind of Teal mindset, super agile, lean setup and everything. And once they grow to a certain level, usually 20, 30, 40 people, they struggle, they put in governance, they hire a CEO, a COO, something, and have some layers introduced. And that's when many startups actually fail, is exactly at that phase. What I think we do differently, even at our small size, so we are 11 people permanent at the moment, so fairly small group size. We do have all these structural elements for proper self-management. So self-management doesn't mean chaos. It doesn't mean no structure. Actually, we have, I don't know how many, 14, maybe 15 different roles that we describe with roles, the accountabilities, what decision authority these roles have. So we have a pretty you probably would say a heavy governance in a way for such a small group. But we do think it's important to have that to also scale. And we've already seen that growing. Just last year, we grew 30 to 40% roughly in headcount. So we saw that governance, that structure helps us. And that's one of the things that I do think is really helpful also for bigger corporations if you want to have that kind of transformation, that kind of agility or tealish idea in the bigger corporation. But certainly you do have more constraints there, simply because for us, we have a little closed system which works in a Teal way. Of course, we have interfaces to the more traditional world. Let's say the Swiss tax authorities, not necessarily the most Teal idea that is behind taxes and all the regulations we have, but that's perfectly fine. And in bigger corporations, you have that a bit closer. So you might look into your business unit maybe, and you do a transformation there and try to create that culture and develop that mindset in a Teal way. And then, of course, you talk to other colleagues, to the business unit next door. You talk to the affiliate that's somewhere around the world. You talk to your finance department, to the IT colleagues maybe. So there's these kind of constraints. But I do think it is completely possible also in a bigger corporation setup. And if you look into science, then actually there's different ranges, but most of them say something between 120 and 150 people is the range that we as human beings still able to recognize and know fairly well. And if you look at that size, then actually, why not have a transformation and build that little system at exactly that size? And that's what we are mostly doing anyway with the bigger corporations. We created little islands. Some point in time, probably there's a question, how do you connect these? But anyway, should be fairly straightforward with a similar mindset and similar principles of collaboration. And then, of course, you do some kind of contracting. You have your stakeholders that you contract with, and you define the interfaces, and that's basically as it is today as well, right? Because it's not like if you look into a big company, it's one culture, it's one way of working. It's actually always dependent on the leadership people there, and it's a ton of subcultures in my mind. So in short, I would say yes, Teal mindset, also possible in a big corporation. There's a few things that might be a bit more difficult, and I think we also get to talk a bit about what kind of structures are actually hindering us, what the structures you need to reduce or maybe get rid of at all to make that work, in my mind at least.
Tim, I've got a question here. If you approach a client, you mentioned you're a consulting company. So how do you come, into this topic? How do you start the conversation? Because obviously nobody brings you in and say, "Hey, we want to be more self-organized," or "We want to be even worse. We want to be Teal." There's companies, and you work, I think, a lot with pharmaceutical companies. So where does this conversation start? What do you attach to?
You know what? It's really surprising because actually last year it started that actually people reached out and said, we want to become a Teal business unit. We want to become a Teal department. So actually this Teal buzzword, this Teal theme seems to come up even in conservative Swiss pharma companies nowadays. So in all sorts of bigger corporations, there's certain groups or certain people who know about Teal and actually like that aspiration and want to get there as well in their setup. But Mike, you're completely right. If we look back like 3-4 years ago, of course, nobody came and said, can we get this Teal organization somehow? Nobody knew really about it in this bigger corporations setup. But what happened, of course, was there's the starting point of a conversation is usually agility. Some people have heard about Scrum or Kanban boards they're using, or maybe derive some things from Lean. And then agility is the starting point, and then we explore together what it really means. And I guess you too as well, you know that a Scrum team doesn't necessarily make your organization more agile. There's a lot more components that will help you along the way and really make you agile, whatever agile exactly means, of course. So that's another thing to define. But I do think that this could also be a starting point, and it actually is a starting point quite a lot of the times. But I think the one pattern or the one theme that you see is that there's some kind of leader, also from a hierarchical level, who is interested in these concepts and thinks it's the right way to go and wants to get this workplace transformed in a bit more human way. And this is probably the starting point of all the conversations. So it's not necessarily always topic driven. It's more like a human connection where we think along the same lines, I guess.
All right. Maybe let me ask it from a different angle. Again, mentioning pharmaceuticals, why would a pharmaceutical company, benefit from this approach to be more self-organized? I mean, is this something they have to do? Is this something they can't survive otherwise, or?
That probably is a philosophical question that different people will answer in different ways. I do think that it's that's an important step to look into, not only for pharmaceuticals. I think it's actually industry independent. If you think about agility or also Teal concepts or self-organized structures, when is that really helpful? And I don't know if you guys know the Cinefin model or the Cinefin framework. Basically has these 4 quadrants, from chaotic and simple, and then complicated and complex. And one thing that I think is an important distinction is if you're in a complex environment, complex means I can't really predict the future. It's lots of uncertainty. It's a complex environment with tons of stakeholders. I don't know how the regulations will shape. I don't even know how my business looks like in a year, if I'm really honest to myself. So that is the complex environment. And I think COVID-19, if anything, was good for exactly that, showing us that we are more or less all live in a complex environment. The difference is the complicated environment. Complicated, for example, building a car is really complicated. Okay, it's nothing that's straightforward, nothing simple that I could do. But we know step by step, screw by screw, how we need to operate to build that car. So it's complicated, but it's totally predictable. And I would say, Mike, for any industry, for any company, for any organization, which is mostly operating in a complex environment. So I don't know step by step what I'm supposed to do. And I can't plan for the next year or two. For all of these industries and for all of the companies in that complex environment, definitely I think Teal self-organized structures are something to look into, simply because you need to be able to react quicker to market changes. You probably need to get more innovation to react to changes from the customer needs. So, and that is something that's happening for pharma as well. Regulations are changing quite frequently. There's more and more cost pressure coming, of course. There's all sorts of other environmental changes that are just difficult to handle. And also pharma companies need to change to that new setup. And also them can't really predict what the business is going to look like in a few years down the road. So I do think it's something that's really important to look into also for pharma companies.
Thank you, Tim. I'm really wondering, because you mentioned in the very beginning the radical self-organization. I'm curious, what are your biggest personal challenges as a leader in such organization?
It's a good question. So if you ask my team from the other company, from the other consultancy before, they would probably say that I'm quite a control freak. So I like to have the control. I like to know what's going on. And living in that self-organized setup where, of course, I don't know everything that's going on. Of course, I don't get to decide everything. I'm not involved in all of the decisions. So this control freak thing, and then on the other hand side, self-organized setup, that's a challenge for me personally, for sure. I think I'm getting better, not yet there. You can ask some of my colleagues there, they still have some tensions with me that I'm not living up to the ambitions there. So this is definitely a struggle. I think the other thing that's also interesting to see, but not necessarily only in the Teal environment, I think always if you live up to that servant leadership idea, is organizational learning. So if you have a certain amount of experience, certain years in the same industry or the same business, you probably hit certain walls. So you tried out things and it was a wall, it was pretty solid, you learn, you don't do it again. The thing is, you can't avoid that organizational learning for your people. I mean, I might give advice and say, look, for me, if you do that, that looks like a pretty solid wall, so I wouldn't go down that route. But it's not my decision. And at the end of the day, letting go of that kind of control in a way, again, it's this control theme, is a thing, and enabling that organizational learning, because the organization will only grow if all of us, if the whole team, if everyone in the team is learning and can make that experience. And maybe I'm even learning and seeing, oh, I thought it was a pretty solid wall, but actually, you know what? It worked out just super fine, and I could have done that the same way 5 years ago myself, and I didn't do it. So there's that part. And I think the last part, which is difficult also for me, is wholeness also means you need to talk about your emotions, you need to talk about your tensions, you need to talk about your frustrations. And while I can talk about my frustrations, I can't always do that in a constructive way. So that means, how do you articulate yourself if you are emotionally triggered by whatever, something, right? And that's for me at least something personal growth area, communicating around the tensions, communicating around my frustrations, around my emotions. And I guess that's the main learning path for me, but there's something else for everyone in the organization, I would say.
Wow. Honestly, that sounds like lots of personal maturity required to thrive in such environment, to be vulnerable, to be able to talk through emotions and tensions. And I would like to dig even further. If you could name your top 3 mistakes or biggest learnings on the way to self-organization, what would that be?
That's a really good question. So from an organizational setup, I think the number one mistake that we did, and I was right in the beginning, all 3 of us came from a consultancy background, and consultants tend to think that we can plan everything, right? So we just know what's going on. And our initial question when we discussed our setup, so the roles and what kind of roles and responsibilities we have, the question we asked ourselves was, what are the roles that we might need going forward to grow the company? So it was that future thinking. And in hindsight, totally stupid question to ask. None of the roles, or not many, are actually there anymore. And the right question to ask, or that we should have asked ourselves, is what are the things that we have right now? Let's document these roles and then make sure that we have this regular update process. And if you know holacracy, then it's probably this governance meeting. So that the tension process used for the organizational setup, for the governance setup. So that was something that we totally over-engineered or over-thought, I guess, in the beginning from a setup perspective. I think the other thing, which you also just mentioned, is it's a hugely challenging environment from a personal perspective, just individually. It requires a lot of maturity. It requires a lot of self-confidence, I think, as well. You have a certain self-worth that's not coming from work as well. So this is definitely a challenge in that setup. I think that we provide that space most of the time where people feel safe enough to just be vulnerable and then grow together. But it's definitely one of the hard things, and it's also something that I struggle with myself quite a lot. And maybe the third learning that we are having is, or that I had, there's not that one right setup. So that there's not that one right process. And I think we see that also with our salary process. Again, it's self-set salaries, but it's really challenging to define your salary yourself. So it always sounds like fun, and that's actually cool to have and everything. But many of us struggle with that. And we had a discussion last year as well, if we really want to keep that process, or maybe if we just have 1 or 2 people deciding for the salary for everyone in the company. So there's these things where it's not the one right process, and you need to find that balance between, am I riding the dead horse already, or am I just not resilient enough to follow through? And finding that balance is incredibly difficult. And I think there's a few learnings on that side where we probably should have followed through on 1 or 2 topics a bit more, and on some a bit less maybe. But that's the key learnings, I would say. If you ask for failures, I think in the whole hiring, onboarding process, getting people up to speed, probably the failure, if you want, is how close are we? Are we too afraid of creating that line manager kind of relationship, and with that leave people alone too much? So I think there we had probably some learnings last year where we should have been a bit more helpful or supportive, and then not be too afraid of kind of creating a line management like relationship, because it wouldn't have been that way. So that's probably one of the failures that we had last year, I think.
Do you think your model, I mean, you said it's a smaller company at the moment, and I'm not sure if you even intend to grow dramatically, but let's assume you want to go for 100 people, or at least don't want to limit it. Do you think it's scalable right now, this way you handle it? Like, everybody's setting their salaries, and how do you think about that?
Yeah, so we don't know how much we want to scale or grow, so that's a different question. We definitely want to grow a bit more, so to probably like 25, 30 people, because that's something where usually in the traditional organization you would at least add 1 layer of management, and we'll definitely not do that. And I think that there will be some interesting learnings. Do I think it will work? Do I think we have a scalable, sustainable setup? I do think so. Will we have all the same structures, processes, and roles and everything? Definitely not. But I do trust our update, our governance process, that we will create these new processes as we go, and maybe with 15 people, there's already something that's going to look a bit different. Maybe the salary process is not done in an approach like now, where I get advice from all of the others. So I would get kind of a speed dating advice on my salary from everyone else. Maybe we do it in circles. Maybe we split it into 2 groups or something like that. So that might happen, but I do think it's scalable in that sense that we have a robust governance process to update our governance. And I do think the role-based setup, so the roles and responsibilities that we have, is a good starting point to scale it as well. And while we don't have proof for that ourselves, of course, we do have proof in customer organizations where exactly these pillars that we discussed before have been implemented, and it does scale, I would say.
I really want to ask Timm about governance. From my experience working with different clients, governance is really, really controversial and scary word, especially in the mix with agile and agility. Are there any myths or misconceptions you would like to address about governance? Because you mentioned this word so many times.
Yeah, so I think governance might be a red flag for some people just from a wording perspective. I use it anyway because I think most people have some kind of picture in mind if I say governance. And at the same time, I do think, same as I said before, agile or Teal organizations are not leaderless. They're managerless, but they're not leaderless. So you always need leadership, and it's the same for structure. If you think about bigger corporations, you have this pyramid type of setup. You have different layers in there, right? And basically, there's one default rule in all of the organizations. If you don't know the answer, or you're not brave enough to actually take the accountability, or we don't have a process, it's a pretty simple rule. You go 1 or 2 levels up and you ask that person what you should do. So you basically just use the hierarchy. Now, the thing is, a self-organized, the Teal organization is flat, right? So there's no hierarchies. So that default rule in most of our organizations, which is just go a level or 2 up and ask the question, that's not existent. We don't have that rule because there's nothing like a level or 2 up. So how do you fill that vacuum? How do you fill that space? Because we still have gaps in our governance. We don't have a process for everything, and we do not think we need one, actually. There's still uncertainty on taking decisions. So how do you go about that? And I do believe that governance is the answer. So you need to provide a structure that helps people in being efficient and being effective in taking decisions and doing their day-to-day work. And if you don't have any structure, it's most likely either chaos or it's super inefficient because you will always discuss everything together and you don't have a direction that people can take steps by themselves. So self-organized for me also means you are independent. You have a certain level of autonomy. And this autonomy you can only create if you create a certain structure. So structure creates autonomy. That's kind of a paradox, but this is how it basically looks like. And that's why I do think governance is one of the key things to have in place.
Thanks a lot for this very elaborate answer. I want to now shift our conversation a little bit to entrepreneurship side and maybe mention also LIVEsciences, right? That you're also part of. And I'm really curious, how do you define, or what are any specific signals you're looking into to define the Teal potential of a startup as an investor?
That's a good question. We actually also had a discussion in our LIVEsciences setup if we would invest into a company, if they need to go the Teal route, if they need to become a Teal startup, a Teal company. And the answer for us was actually no. We would probably be there and be in an advisory type of relationship where we'd probably talk about the organizational setup and probably would talk about some of these ideas. But at the end of the day, these companies are independent. They need to find their own path, and we will not impose Teal organization setup on them anyway. What we do look into there is, of course, a certain purpose fit for us is really important. So is there something that really makes a difference, or is it just a kind of a money-making idea that's not really changing the world? So that's something that we are discussing. And then obviously there's also a bit more kind of typical venture capital questions like, is the IP protected? Is this a good business model actually? You know, so there's all sorts of different conversations that are happening there. And LIVEsciences is also a group of people, a smaller group of people. They're not all coming from LIVEsciences, and actually I think while they all know the Teal concept, I'm not even sure if they all would buy into this Teal kind of idea. So LiveVenture is really a little bit different from that Teal setup that we have with LIVEsciences, but at the same time, we're looking to live our purpose also through LiveVentures. And this whole thing that we try with LiVesciences is catalyze success, in short. So how can you have a catalytic type of work to change something in the world and make it a little bit better? And we thought, well, actually, we're pretty blessed that we are in Switzerland. Economical situation is really good, and there are a ton of smart people out there who have really great ideas, but may not have that right environment to thrive and develop these further. And then we said, well, maybe LiveVentures is a good catalytic purpose driving organization in a way, and that's more or less the starting point. But again, we would invest in all sorts of startups from other fit criteria. They don't need to go Teal, and I don't think Teal is the only answer anyway. It's also not that rigid thing, Teal is good and everything else is bad. I think it always depends on the situation.
Thank you. Another question, because we're talking still, I'm willing to explore the entrepreneurial side of mindset. What would you name the best entrepreneurial advice you ever got?
Wow, difficult question. I remember some really bad ones. That's probably the easier question. But the best entrepreneurial advice maybe was to just believe in my ideas and then try it out. So get away from that theoretical building a business plan kind of story. Go talk to customers, try it out, and see if it lands or if it doesn't land. So kind of this advice around it's only a business if there's really a business. And I mean, it's a bit controversial in the sense that in, for example, the Silicon Valley, there's that saying, fake it till you make it. And my advice that I got, and I think it was a good one actually, was more like, make it so you don't have to fake it in a way. But I guess get away from that theoretical discussion ground was the number one advice that I got that was really helpful for me.
Oh, I absolutely love it. Thank you.
Interesting enough, I'm trying to get a little bit back to the corporate world, and as you mentioned, pharmaceuticals and Switzerland. Obviously, there's a lot of stuff happening. You mentioned managers before, and we probably all know Novartis is on their unbossing journey since a few years, and it's quite a large company. It's more than 100,000 people. But still, if you talk about this whole self-organization thing, and we already mentioned leaders who might be a little bit scared. What about investors? I mean, it's my money I'm putting here on the table, and obviously we talk about here, this thing of we value people because we need people's brains and people's creativity, but it's easy talking when I put a few bucks on the table. How would you see that?
I hope there's not too many venture capitalists watching this, because what I will say is that venture capital industry, I think, is probably most traditional, the one that is the furthest away from a Teal idea that I know, at least. So that's the short answer, Mike. And I think if you're looking for investment and you try to explain that investor who's, I don't know, about to spend 1 million Swiss francs with you, and you explain that you don't have a COO or you don't have a CTO or something like that because you believe in self-organization and people can decide themselves, then you really need to be lucky to find that investor putting the 1 million Swiss francs with that kind of idea, I think. So yes, for startups, it is really difficult, I think, to get to that Teal kind of company setup and at the same time raising money. So I think this is really difficult, simply because the mindset, the whole idea is not arrived in that space yet, I think. And at the same time, I mean, for us, for me, and also with the guys in LiveVentures who are not necessarily big fans of Teal, but they do believe in autonomy and they do believe in quick decision making and the bottom line profit, that there can be better or can be increased with a Teal kind of idea. And it's the same that we do with bigger corporations, actually. You might not go to that end of that scale with fully self-organized and the transparent salaries and everything. But what you can always look into is what's the bottom line result that you want to improve, right? And I do think that there's a lot of resource and time waste in any organization. For example, decision making is something that can totally change the world for a startup, but also for a big company. And decision-making processes, looking into consent decision-making instead of consensus, for example, will save you a lot of resource. And it's nothing you need to have a role-based or a Teal setup for. So this is one thing that you can definitely do. And there's a few other aspects that I think you can kind of try to incorporate into your setup in a startup world, in a big corporate world, and still make your investors happy in kind of having a traditional kind of setup.
One thing you mentioned a couple of times, governance. You mentioned roles and everything, and I'm not sure if we mentioned it, but it sounds like you're a little bit into holacracy. Is that right, or not really? Or did you start there, or?
We started to explore holacracy before we incorporated the life sciences company. So we looked into that. We kept some of the elements. So we do have a governance meeting. We do have a role-based setup, which looks like the holacracy ones. And at the same time, and I think that there was actually last year a bigger conference in Brussels around the holacracy 2.0 idea. Yeah. This holacracy clearly was lacking, or maybe still is, this mindset piece. It's also lacking this human kind of aspect. It's, I think, pretty good for the self-management setup. So if you look into a role-based setup and what that might look like, I think it's really good. I do think that the governance process, for example, is quite helpful. Some meetings might feel a bit rigid or mechanic in the first place, and so we kind of tweaked it a bit for ourselves. But I do think holacracy is a good basis to explore at least the self-organization for evolutionary purpose and also wholeness. I do think there's better ideas out there.
Okay. Right. So that sounds like, I mean, it can be a good starting point, but you have to look after certain things which might not come with a tool, a framework, or anything else. There is sometimes this word of holacracy puts role over soul. And if we talk, about people, there's soul is quite an important one. And I know it's a strong sentence here, but
yeah.
Coming a little bit to the end of our session here, what would you, recommend or, give a little bit of tips for anybody who want to embark on this journey, what to look after, what to focus on first?
So I think one is this maturity level, or that stage of you're that crazy odd guy that's trying agility or Teal or self-organizing setups. That's not the stage anymore. So there's a ton of pioneers out there, there's a ton of examples out there. And what I recommend is talk to them. Try to get first-hand information, insights from their journey, from what they tried. There's a ton of different frameworks out there. Also, many actually kind of homegrown little systems and governance and structures and everything. So I do think one recommendation is just go out, talk to the people, see what's going on there. Definitely a good starting point. And then the other thing, which I said before, was kind of my entrepreneurial advice as well, that I got a few years back, is just try it out. Because the thing is, if you talk about Teal and self-organization, it is abstract. It is incredibly difficult to explain to people why that would make a difference. And I would think it's also incredibly difficult for you yourself to see what the benefit might be. And it's a rather theoretical exercise. So I would just say, just do it, get yourself into it. Of course, there might be some help from within your organization or outside the organization, from people who have done it before, that have good advice. Because one is, and that's the holacracy thing as well, it's not only about self-management and roles and responsibilities, it's also about the mindset that we talked about before, the Teal mindset. There's a lot of leadership things, there's purpose. And purpose is not the same as we've done for 20 years, like vision and mission statements and all these things. That's a totally different story if you do it right. So anyway, get inspiration from the outside world, because there's a ton of great examples. And two, probably get advice from somebody who's gone through that already, maybe a bit of coaching. It's also always helpful if you have somebody system neutral, so somebody who's not within that organizational system. We also use certain coaches for our setup, for example. So most of us have an individual coach, but we also hire coaches from time to time to just develop the team further. And I do think it's incredibly helpful, because it's always a bit more neutral observer from the outside.
Thanks so much. I think that was a very rich in content session. So thanks again for sharing your experience and all the tips. How can our audience follow your work, and what's your preferred way to keep in touch?
Usually LinkedIn works quite well. So I also have some articles around the self-set salaries really and how it works there. We do have a company profile, so you can look at the company profile. We share some things there. Of course, on the website we have our lifeline document. So this is kind of the core document describing our way of working, our thinking about how we want to work together. So that might be helpful, but you also find it on LinkedIn. So in general, LinkedIn is a good way to connect, and I share content there from time to time, and of course over the company profile we share lots of content there as well. That's helpful.
Thank you.
Sure. Welcome.
All right. So I think we're coming to an end. Now that's you want to say goodbye. I mean, we've got a couple of sessions coming up over the next weeks, but here it's to close this one.
Sure.
Yep. I don't really know who is coming up with our next episode, so please stay tuned. We'll share the announcement soon. And yeah, that is it. Thank you once again for joining, and see you next episode.
Perfect. Thanks a lot for having me. It was a pleasure.
Welcome. Thank you. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye.